Let's talk about closures in JavaScript. But before we get into that, let me just make one quick introduction. So what you see here on screen is that I have a variable called x whose value is 10. And then I've also got a function called printx. And basically what the function is doing is it's simply logging the value of x. And if I run this code, you'll see that it actually works. Now, the interesting thing that you might notice, or if you've already kind of been doing JavaScript for a little while, you might be like, yeah, what's the big deal? But it is something worth pointing out is that the x variable hasn't actually been passed into the function. The function has access to it because they exist within the same scope. And so therefore, the kind of interesting thing about JavaScript is that functions have access to variables that were not passed in so long as they are within the same scope. And basically, to kind of sum that point up, functions in JavaScript can access variables and values within their lexical scope. Okay, so with that introduction out of the way, let's kind of dive into what a closure actually is. So let me define a function called outer. And then what outer is going to do is it's going to define a local variable x, which we're going to say its value will be 10. Doesn't really matter what the value is. And then another thing that this function outer is going to do is it's going to define a function called inner. And now what inner is going to do whenever it gets called is it's simply going to log the value of x. And then finally, the last thing that the outer function will do whenever it gets called is it's going to return the inner function to whoever's calling it, just like that. Okay, so now let's go ahead and say const inner right out here, which is going to be equal to the return of outer. So in other words, when I'm actually calling the outer function, I'm going to be getting the inner function returned to myself. So therefore, inner is in fact the function now. And when I go ahead and invoke it, here's the interesting part. Okay, so let's kind of follow through. I have a variable called x, which is scoped only to the outer function. It shouldn't exist anywhere outside of the outer function. Then I have a function called inner, which whenever it's going to get called is attempting to log the value of x. And then finally, outer is returning the inner function, which means that I will, outside of the outer scope, have access to my inner function. Because again, when I call outer, I'm going to get my inner function. So I have access to it outside of my outer scope. But what I don't get access to outside of my outer scope is the value of x. It's not getting passed out of outer. It only exists inside of outer. And so what logic might dictate is here, when I'm actually trying to invoke the inner function, which is attempting to log the value of x, it's trying to log it outside of outer. Therefore, it should technically be out of scope, and this code shouldn't work. But when I do run this code, as you can see, I do in fact get the value of 10. And that's what a closure is in JavaScript. So basically, the idea is like this. The inner function has access to this x variable, again, like I said earlier, because they're within the same scope. Functions have access to variables that exist within their lexical scope. But the kind of neat thing that's happening here is this JavaScript will notice that at a later point in time, even after the outer function no longer exists, someone is still going to need value or access to this x variable here. And the proof is in the fact that we're returning the inner function, which basically means the only way that you can get access to the inner function is if the outer function has already been invoked. And since the inner function needs access to the x variable, that means that someone is going to need access to the x variable even after the outer function has already been run and done and no longer exists. And so what JavaScript does to make sure that this code runs properly and therefore that the inner function can still actually use the x variable is it keeps the x variable alive. And that's essentially what a closure is. Hope that was clear. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you in the next one.